All right, so here we go with Chapter 2, Part 2 of our recording, starting on page 33 of our book with At Least They Are Trying. Oklahoma, like the rest of America, had been trying to fix its schools for a long time. Between 1969 and 2007, the state had more than doubled the amount of money it spent per student in constant dollars. Over the years, Oklahoma had hired thousands of new teachers' aides, granted badly needed raises to teachers, and lowered the student-to-teacher ratio, so smaller class sizes, in other words. By 2011, over half the state budget went to education, but most of Oklahoma's kids still could not demonstrate competency in math. To motivate kids in schools to do better, state lawmakers decided to create an incentive. In the late 1980s, they passed a law requiring students to take a test to graduate from high school. This kind of end-of-school test was standard in the countries that performed at the top of the world on the PISA test. It gave kids and teachers a clear mission, and it made a diploma mean something. A few years later, however, Oklahoma's lawmakers delayed the test. It was a matter of compassion, or so they said. The lawmakers were worried too many students would fail. How would that look? Those kids would have attended 4 years of high school without getting a diploma. That didn't feel right. The parents wouldn't like it either. So the test was set aside, and the kids were left to fail a little later, in the real world, if they didn't know enough math to take college classes for credit or couldn't get a job that paid above minimum wage. After that, the governor of Oklahoma tried a kinder, gentler strategy. He signed an executive order requiring kids to pass a series of literacy tests, starting in 8th grade. That meant they had 4 years to retake the test if they failed. However, just before this new mandate could take effect, Oklahoma's legislature scrapped this requirement too. Lawmakers said they were worried about lawsuits from angry parents. The state's history read like a slow-motion tug-of-war between hopes and fears, as if no one could agree what Oklahoma's children were capable of doing, a lack of faith that surely trickled down to the students. Kids have a really good detector about what adults take seriously and what counts. As a 1997 Teachers Union report noted, if they see that it doesn't count, then they're not going to do the hard work. As a student, what do you think about that statement? Do you agree or disagree? Do you think that when you see something doesn't count, do you not put in the work? Or do you still do the work because you know that there's going to be a benefit for it down the road? Which side of that do you think you fall on? Also, just to point out a little bit of writing strategy up a little bit before this, the state's history read like a slow motion tug of war between hopes and fears. So that's imagery right there. You can really imagine or picture what the author is trying to say. It's an excellent writing strategy to try. Moving on here. In 2005, Oklahoma tried yet again, passing a law to require students to show a mastery of English, algebra, geometry, biology, and U.S. history in order to receive a diploma. The state had 7 years to phase in the requirement, gently and humanely. Kids who failed could retake the test up to 3 times in 1 year, or they could take alternate tests, like the SAT. They could even opt to do special projects demonstrating their competence in any subject that they'd failed. In 2011, as the graduation test was finally about to take effect, local newspapers warned that thousands of kids might not graduate. An Oklahoma School Boards Association official predicted that the results would be devastating. One superintendent told the Tulsa World that the graduating class of seniors might be known as the lost generation. A Republican legislator, introduced a bill to delay the test for 2 more years. When I first visited Kim's hometown, the young new superintendent of Sallisaw gave me a tour of the brick 1-story high school past the orange and yellow lockers lining the cinder block hallways. The last high school had been built by WPA workers during the Depression. This one, opened in 1987, looked like many American high schools. Institutional, but tidy, with blocks of color and light. The basketball court was the school's jewel. The school's black diamond mascot, gleaming on the hardwood floor, dated back to the 1920s when coal mining was a major local industry. Scott Farmer had just been appointed the town's first new superintendent in 20 years. He had short brown hair and a boyish face. The state of Oklahoma had 530 superintendents like him, each with their own fiefdom. There was about as many superintendents in Oklahoma as there were members of Congress for the entire country. This tradition of hyper-local control, hardwired for inefficiency, hinted at one reason that the United States spent so much more than other countries on education. Farmer made about $100,000 per year, which made him one of the top earners in Sallisaw. He had an assistant superintendent too, along with 8 director-level managers and a school board. It was quite an operation for a district that included just 4 schools, but it was hardly unusual. Compared to the rest of the state, in fact, Sallisaw was one of the more efficient school districts in Oklahoma. When I asked Farmer to describe Sallisaw High School's biggest challenge, he talked mostly about parental involvement, lamenting the low turnout for parent-teacher conferences. "I'm just not convinced that parents quit caring," Farmer said, shaking his head, "but that's something we need to work on, reminding them of the importance of lifelong learning." I'd heard this argument often in U.S. schools, not just in Oklahoma. It seemed to be common knowledge that parents were AWOL in our schools. Even other parents thought so. In a survey about the best ways to improve education, most American adults cited more involved parents. Reality was more complicated, however. Whatever U.S. parents were doing wrong, they were in fact showing up at their children's schools more often than they had in 20 years. In 2007, 9 out of 10 parents said they'd attended at least one parent-teacher conference or school meeting that year. Some were coming to school for disciplinary meetings, uncomfortable encounters with assistant principals and stone-faced kids. But whether they came for positive reasons or negative, American parents were not as hands-off as most of us seem to think. So what explained the disconnect? It might have depended on how you defined involved. When I talked to Ernie Martins, Sallisaw High School's principal for the past decade, he had no complaints about parental involvement. Sure, parent-teacher conferences weren't as well attended as they were in the younger grades, but that was okay, he said. High school students didn't need that kind of hand-holding. Instead, about 3/4 of Sallisaw parents got involved in some other way, usually with the Football Booster Club, the Basketball Booster Club, or the Future Farmers of America chapter. Only about 1 in 4 of his parents were what he would consider uninvolved. In fact, Principal Martin said his biggest problem was not parental involvement at all. His biggest problem was expectations. He said, too high. They were, he said, too high. Politicians and so-called reformers expected too much from his students. "We have a lot of our kids who come from dysfunctional homes," he said. "We're the only normal thing they have in their life." It was all well and good to talk about high expectations and political speeches, but he lived in the real world, in a part of the country where some parents read to their children and some never did. In his world, some mothers thought breakfast was a bag of potato chips, and some fathers hid methamphetamines in their backpack and the backyard barbecue. In Sallisaw, nearly 1 in 4 students failed to graduate high school within 4 years. Martins and Farmer had different narratives about why that was, but they were both looking in the same direction. Neither saw education itself as the primary problem or the main solution. Both pointed to external forces. So external forces, that means like things beyond their control. Negligent parents, social ills, or an out-of-touch government expectations. That too was a common refrain among educators all over the United States. Whatever the problem was, it seemed, it was largely outside their control. And they were right, of course. A long list of grim factors lay beyond their reach. From how much kids slept to how much television they watched. The stress that kids endured in many families taxed their bodies and minds, doing damage that no school could undo. The only problem with this narrative was that it was habit forming. Once you start locating the source of your problems outside your own jurisdiction, it's hard to stop, even when the narrative is wrong. For example, Sallisaw had plenty of good students too. Other than the destitute and the dropouts, Sallisaw High School had its success stories like every town. About half the kids who graduated from Sallisaw enrolled in public colleges and universities in Oklahoma. Others went to out-of-state colleges or looked for jobs. What happened to these success stories after they left? Their colleges tested their basic skills and found them wanting. More than half of these students were promptly placed into remedial classes at Oklahoma public colleges. That meant that some of Sallisaw's best students were paying good money for college, often in the form of student loans, but they weren't getting college credit. These young men and women had been told their whole lives to get a high school diploma and go to college. That was the dream. But when they got there, they were stalled in limbo, redoing algebra or English as if they'd never left high school. It wasn't hard to understand why. As their debt mounted, many quit college altogether. 1 out of 2 Oklahoma University students failed to graduate within 6 years. I asked Principal Martins about all the Sallisaw alumni who were retaking math or English. That really doesn't bother me, he said, because at least they're trying. The main goal was to go to college. Whether his graduates succeeded there was out of his control, or so it seemed. The fact that those kids had spent 4 years in his school preparing to get to college, and that he'd given them a diploma that was supposed to mean they were ready, did not seem relevant. We'll stop there for this recording. We'll carry on with Chapter 2 in a bit.